Welcome to Lawful Rebel TV, and once again it's a great pleasure to be joined by Pete Stone from Leicester, fellow thinker and author of the book The System, Death by a Thousand Cuts. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's good to be here.
Great stuff. Today we are going to be talking about the issue of climate change disaster based on anthropogenic related CO2 emissions. So this whole story in the mainstream narrative that the green movement and everybody clings to, it's already used to justify taxes and various controls and measures. It's already deeply entrenched in our culture, this assumption that we have to save the planet, we have to reduce, we have to curtail and reduce perhaps industrial production, and maybe even stop developing countries from industrializing.
That's right.
So, it's a very interesting topic, isn't it, Peter? Because it does seem to, I think it's one of those core issues. It's a big one that needs to be addressed, and it's a difficult one because there's that there's that appeal to authority and appeal to majority. Because X number of scientists say this must be the truth, and I was shocked. Just to quickly make this point, I was shocked to see that Dave Rubin was justifying his stance on accepting that the mainstream climate theory. He kept reciting the fact of so many scientists. If all these scientists, then they must be right, but flagrantly ignoring the fact that truth isn't a factor of numbers.
Absolutely. Science isn't done by consensus; it's done by science, facts, and evidence. And if we touch on this. The official narrative where so many scientists all agree that man-made global warming exists. If we look a little bit deeper into their figures, and I think the figure that they bandy around is 97% of all scientists agree. If we look into that, we'll realize that the figure's been manipulated. So the way the government did this is I think they started with something like 11,000 white papers and scientific reports trying to detail man-made global warming. And they cherry-picked less than 100 out of that. And then they detailed it a little bit less. And I think they got it down to about 79 scientists that almost fitted the official narrative. And then they could only get about 77 of those scientists to agree with the official narrative. And they says, well, 77 out of 79, well, that's 97% of all scientists. And that's where we get all scientists agree to man-made global warming. It's fraudulent, and it's the manipulation of the figures, really.
Yes, we have to acknowledge that we can't believe directly many figures and things, but it's certainly not a game of numbers. I mean, science and the facts of reality are the facts of reality. It doesn't matter whether the truth is being spoken by somebody in a minority of one. So, right. But I think we have to let's zoom out for a moment and maybe define a few terms or agree that. I mean, I think that it's widely agreed that climate change happens. There's no debate about is climate change real. I think we have to be clear and identify it as man-made and extra-generated climate change that is actually disastrous, or that's debatable. So I think to start with, what's agreed is that climate change definitely happens, and also that global warming is real. For example, we cycle in and out of ice ages. I mean, we'd all agree that nobody's denying that global warming happens. Nobody's denying that the climate changes. No one's denying, certainly not in the rational debate that we're trying to have here, that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. That's one that's all acknowledged, and also we're not denying the fact that human economic activity can increase levels of CO2. So those are all facts on the table that are not in dispute. And of course, it's unhelpful to talk in terms of climate deniers. I mean, this is just nonsense. And of course, that comes from the side of the debate that would have us all believe that there is a disaster. So that's worth noting. Yeah, how would you summarise the argument, Peter? How would you summarise in a nutshell, what is being claimed and foisted upon us in the mainstream?
Yes, that's a good point. Yes, climate change has always been going on since day one. I think the Earth is something like 4.8 billion years old, and the climate has always been changing. In fact, the early climate, there was no climate, there was no life on this planet, and it evolved over many, many millions and billions of years. I think the Earth has been a ball of ice about 8 times in its history, basically a frozen planet 8 times, and it's also been much, much warmer than it is today.
That's an important part of the context, isn't it? To not forget that CO2 levels have in the atmosphere, the parts per million number, generally now to be recommended around 400, I believe. But it's been much higher than that in the Earth's evolution, I believe, and it's also been much warmer. You know, the Holocene maximum, I believe, was that about 3,000 years ago? Don't quote me on the exact. Yeah.
Yep.
So we know that it's been much warmer, and here we still are. You know, there hasn't been any thermal runaway or positive feedback loop that has made the planet, you know, fry up and fizz out of existence so far, even though it has been warmer. So that goes a long way to undermining the urgent concern about it getting warmer.
That's right. It's been warmer and it's been cooler. And also the oxygen content and CO2 content of the atmosphere has also been different. And it's been much, much higher in the past. In fact, right now, we are actually dangerously low in CO2. I think it's about 400 parts per million. And if it got below somewhere between 200 and 150, all plant life would die out. And then you'd have no life on this planet. So if you go back over the history of the planet, you'll realize that you'll find, using, I think, ice core measurements, that the planet has been somewhere around 7,000 parts per million and also 15,000 parts per million. And the planet was doing just fine.
That was that with humans on the planet, Pete, or is that prior to human arrival?
That's prior to humans, and this is just normal animal life. In fact, it's really just to try and make a point. I think we've all seen the film Jurassic Park with the dinosaurs and whatnot. Well, if you actually had dinosaurs today, they would all suffocate because there just isn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere today to support dinosaurs. So if you go back into the history of dinosaurs and large insects, you'll find that the oxygen content was a lot higher, and so was the CO2. And this promoted large plant growth. That's why you got the large plants like 65 million years ago. And you also had the larger insects. This is another reason why insects are a lot smaller today, because the oxygen content is a lot smaller, and so is the CO2 content.
It is very important for us to remind ourselves that CO2 is plant food. It's not inherently a toxic substance. It's not a poison. It can't be said in any meaningful terms to be considered a pollutant. So just to rewind and tie that up with what are the main points of the debate here. The mainstream version of the climate disaster scenario would argue that a climate disaster is about to take place due to the amount of human-caused CO2 release, a greenhouse gas, increasing the amount of heat that the planet retains, and via feedback mechanisms, this causing some sort of thermal runaway disaster, spelling doom and gloom. So that's the central claim. I think we'd probably both agree. Do correct me if you think I'm wrong. And it rests on the assumption that more CO2 is bad in the atmosphere, which I think is questionable. And it also rests on the assumption that higher temperatures of the global higher average global temperatures would inherently and necessarily be bad. And I think both of those two premises are questionable. As we've already discussed, it's been a lot warmer already. There's been more plant life. You know, we know CO2 is a fuel. So the premises within that scary future prediction of human caused. You know, remember, we are the problem. We must curtail our activity. So that's kind of it can be said to be an anti-human life sort of requirement that we all reduce our activity. And that recommendation is being said on these questionable assumptions that more CO2 is bad and higher temperatures will be bad. So can you expand a little bit about that, Pete? Maybe those two things that are questionable. I mean, it would pick up either whether you like the assumption that this more plant food in the air is going to be a problem for us all, as opposed to a huge boom and huge yield increases.
If I could just touch on the greenhouse gas. This title, this phrase is bandied around quite a lot. And everyone makes the claim that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Well, that's partially true. The truth is there is a greenhouse gas on this planet, and it makes up 95% of the greenhouse effect, and that would be water vapor. So we've all experienced this if we've been out on a sunny day and it's cloudy. The clouds come in, it goes cooler. The clouds move away, it gets warmer. So this is something that we can all experience and understand. So the greenhouse gas effect really comes from clouds. And the government knows they couldn't really tax clouds. I don't think the general public would fall for that. So they had to switch it and go to CO2. Well, if we take a look at the CO2, and you've got to understand a little bit about thermodynamics. So very quick lesson, if you apply energy to something, it warms up. If you remove the energy, it cools down. Now, if you look at the thermodynamic property of CO2, it is actually impossible for it to cause global warming on this planet, because the thermodynamic properties of CO2 are virtually the same as oxygen and nitrogen. Well, our atmosphere is made up of about 70% nitrogen, and then it's made up of about 28% oxygen. So if the official narrative is pointing at CO2 and saying that's warming up the planet because of thermodynamics, then you've also got to point at the oxygen, and you've also got to point at the nitrogen, which is, of course, what the scientists don't do or the politicians don't do, and that confuses people.
Yeah. Well, the whole debate is sort of framed incorrectly, isn't it? It's interesting to note that Alex Epstein, in his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, makes a great case that the whole framing of the debate is sort of anti-human. The whole come from is about reducing our impact on the environment, rather than, and as opposed to, an approach which would be, how can we best serve human flourishment? How can we best manage energy? What would be the most ideal outcome for humanity? And this is very much not the way the debate is framed. And of course, the various advantages and disadvantages of certain technologies are not fairly represented. You know, the negative effects of CO2 are championed and blown out of proportion, you know, as we've just seen, and the beneficial effects, i.e., you know, plant growth being hugely accelerated. I think it was Patrick Moore once that said the ideal level of carbon dioxide, of atmospheric carbon dioxide, is something around 1,200 parts per million, which is 3 times higher than we've got at the moment. So. Yes. So the potential advantages, which must outweigh, or not outweigh, be taken into account. They must be taken into account in any rational debate, and they're not, which is a bit sad.
And you've touched on the main reason behind the official narrative of man-made global warming, which is really population control. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the world population away from fossil fuels. But fossil fuels aren't fossil fuels. We'll touch on that shortly. But they want us to move away from fossil fuels, and they want us into, laughingly, what is called renewables, which would be solar panels and wind farms, that sort of thing. Now, here's a tip. The reason why the government call these renewable energies is that quite sadistic, and they're having a little bit of a joke at people's expense. It's not because the energy from the sun is renewable. It's because the equipment is renewable, and the taxpayer is going to have to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Because the solar panels, a typical solar panel has a half-life of something like 5 to 7 years, maybe 10 at the tops. And for windmills, turbines, that's around 10 to 15 years tops. When these technologies reach this sort of age, you can't fix them. They have to be replaced. And it's going to be the taxpayer who pays for it. So, yes, you're right. So one of the reasons they're trying to push this man-made global warming onto us, oh, and by the way, it was originally man-made global cooling, then it was man-made global warming, then it was climate change, and then they were actually going to bring out climate stagnation, because there's been no climate change or global warming for almost 20 years. So, but putting that to one side, but you're absolutely correct. This man-made global warming is about taxation and control, and it's also about the destruction of third world countries who aren't allowed to develop fossil fuels, and I use that in quote marks. And if they can't use fossil fuels, they can't develop an economy, and that's what it's really about.
Yes, it's interesting to note that coal-fired power stations, allegedly, so I'm told, can produce electricity far more cheaply, than all these replaceables, as Alex Epstein calls them, the unreliable energy sources. Because of course, when you want to turn on your kettle and have a cup of tea, either the sun's gone in or the wind stopped. But the point being that fossil fuels are incredibly cheap, and the coal-fired power stations, particularly with the technology that's available now to clean up the emissions, would very literally almost only be producing CO2, which again is arguably not a bad thing, given the payoff of the immense benefits of cheap energy. It's interesting with regards to energy cheapness and availability also, Pete, to note that human well-being and lifestyle increases and all these things are, directly proportional to the availability of cheap energy. We need cheap energy.
The cheapest energy, like you mentioned earlier, would be coal. And modern technologies today means that we can get coal extremely cheaply and we can burn it cleanly. And the only byproduct of coal pretty much is CO2, which anyone who knows basic science is plant food. Oh, and a little tip about CO2 is that on the plant side of things, the more CO2 a plant has, the less water it needs. So not only would increasing the CO2 of the atmosphere help plants, but it wouldn't need the plants would need as much water as well. So the end result is a win-win, and then you'll end up with larger farming and more crops, which would help starvation in third world countries.
Absolutely. Let's also remember that the doomsday scenario, the justification for all the controls, the taxes, the geoengineering, no less, which we'll come back to, this is a massively important point. The justification for all of that is this disaster scenario, which will allegedly happen due to the mathematical multipliers and the feedback loops for warming with every doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. And Lord Monckton, who's previously been on the show, has dismantled the maths of these computer models and shown them to be wildly inaccurate. And obviously we can look back at their history, from today in early 2019. If we look back and see how the models of previous decades have correlated with what's happened, we can actually see that they are hugely inaccurate as well. So it seems that at almost every step of building this argument, upon which hugely significant and really destructive things are happening to the planet, namely with geoengineering. Sure. It's just shocking that all of this stuff is being justified on such shaky scientific grounds. And this is why I would appeal to all you thinking people out there to avail yourself of the facts of this argument and really look at it as a thinking individual. And it doesn't stack up. It just doesn't stack up.
Yes, you're right. It doesn't stack up at all. And that's not even considering ClimateGate, where there was about 25% of all these so-called climate scientists were caught red-handed fraudulently changing the figures. And they were talking back and forth on these emails discussing how to make the figures fit the political narrative. I mean, someone hacked their They hacked it and they dumped all the emails onto their website for everyone to see, and we could see with our own eyes they were deliberately messing with the figures, and they were trying to mislead the general public and continue the lie that man-made global warming is real.
Yeah, that's absolutely shocking, isn't it? And that should be, talk about needing a smoking gun, or yet another reason for people to really sit up and smell the coffee, as it were. But another one of these glaringly obvious ones, I think, is famously in his film An Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore dramatically walks along the length of this graph that he points out is an illustration of the interrelationship between atmospheric levels of CO2 and atmospheric temperature levels, or average global temperatures, constructed from ice core data. And he talks about the complex relationship of these two factors, but it's actually misrepresented, and it's temperature that lags. It's CO2 that leads, and temperature lags behind this interrelationship, this complex interrelationship. Which, again, when we're looking at the basic facts, it's very difficult to argue that something that follows with a time lag of about 800 years due to the action of the oceans and all this sort of thing, and the slowness of warming. But if something has a lag, to argue that it's the cause of it, listen carefully to those arguments, because I've heard some of them and they're really slippery. They just don't stack up.
That's right. Yeah, it's temperature first. So the planet warms up first, and like you say, there's about an 800-year lag before the CO2 changes. And this is really because what's going on is, as the temperature starts to increase, then life flourishes on the planet, because energy brings life. And then when the life flourishes, this increases the CO2 content, and that's why there's an 800-year lag. So, and going back to Al Gore, man, he was the one who was saying there was going to be, New York was going to be under water by 20 foot of water by the year 2000, something like that. 2020,
I think it was, something like that. It was a 20-foot rise in sea levels or something.
That was it, 20-foot rise or something like that. And it turns out that, what did he go and do? He bought a multi-million-pound beachfront property. So I'm thinking, okay, well, you clearly don't think that the seas are going to rise if you've just gone and bought a beachfront property for 2.3 million or whatever it was. So these politicians are easily caught out, but people just need to wake up, think, and just look at the evidence.
Yeah. Speaking of evidence, I'm reminded of an article in the Spectator magazine by a chap called Matt Ridley, who illustrated that over the last 30 to 40 years, you can see that the planet has been greening. It's apparently 14% greener than it was those decades ago, as revealed by NASA, imagery taken from satellite data. So this is a bit of an awkward truth that does back up and fit in nicely with the fact that CO2 is plant food. And would it really be a disaster if CO2 levels were to increase? Would it really be a disaster? Because I think it's important to also acknowledge that the environmental debate, the CO2 induced disaster, is yet another reason that capitalism is bashed, isn't it? The whole industrial revolution that brought us this technology we speak on now, the computers, the cars, the homes, the washing machines, the fridges, all of these things that we use, this whole technology, it's all been brought to us through the Age of Reason and the Industrial Revolution, really leading the way. And if now we're turning around and attacking industrialization and and capitalism and the use of fossil fuels, it's all seems to me to have a common denominator of being anti-life. When we really look at the facts, the foundational facts, it seems to be anti-life to me.
It is. It's anti-life, and it's basically communism, with a very small ruling class that will control everything, and the rest of us basically on this planet living third world lives. That's the agenda behind man-made global warming, and people need to research Agenda 21 and Agenda 30 The government's got plans for us living in cities. They don't want anyone living out in the countryside. They want us to stay in little tiny apartments about the same size as what people live in Japan. We eat plastic food. I mean, you look into what the government's got planned for us. It's quite shocking. But yeah, this is one of the driving problems with this is one of the issues with global warming, one of the agendas behind it. Oh, and I just want to touch on smart meters. One of the reasons why smart meters are being forced onto us, I mean, putting aside the ill effects from the the 5G and everything, putting that aside, it's the technocrats. They know that they are trying to get us out of our fossil fuels or abiotic hydrocarbons, which is very cheap energy, and they're getting us into extremely expensive electricity energy that isn't going to last because these wind farms and whatnot are going to break down. And then these smart meters are going to be used to ration electricity. Now, that's what's coming. Now, at the moment, if you've got an old analog meter in your home and you don't pay the bill or anything like that, then the courts have to go through certain procedures. The police have to come to your house, activate a warrant. They have to enter your home, and then an electrician has to then cut you off on most houses. With a smart meter, it can be done in an office somewhere by one touch of a mouse.
Done remotely, yeah.
Done remotely. No one has to come to you. And they're even putting the legislation in place that warrants and all this sort of stuff isn't even necessary. So it's all coming. That's the insidious nature of smart meters. It's about rationing electricity.
If I can just interject with smart meters.
Sure.
The interesting thing about smart meters also is that it's really something you don't want in your home for health reasons, along with Wi-Fi, along with great care with regard to cell phone use. A smart meter is a serious threat to your health and well-being if you permit one to be installed in your living space. So I'd really recommend looking into EMFs. In fact, we've got other videos on the channel here where I'm talking with Mark Mager about that. So do check that out. But smart meters, bad news, very much in the interest, as you pointed out there, Pete, of the power companies, but not in our interest.
These smart meters are much, much more powerful than the average smartphone, and the frequencies is actually higher than a microwave oven. So, and these smart meters are designed to never have, if you've got a cheap mobile phone, you might not have reception. Well, these smart meters pump out so much power, they're not ever not going to have reception, if that makes sense. So they're much more powerful. And putting this aside, it's also extremely cheeky because the electricity company is actually using your electricity to run the smart meter to send the data to them and then charging you for the use of the electricity. So just put that out there as well.
Great. A nice
double cheeky. But,
Peter, maybe could we, sorry to interject, could you explain a little bit about why fossil fuels might not be fossil fuels? Let's just, I know that might be a big can of worms, but I haven't heard any of the evidence of that, so this is a new one to me as well. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure, no problem. This does take some digging on the internet. I'm going to give you a quick history lesson on why fossil fuels are called fossil fuels to begin with, so people have a basic understanding. Go back to the 1800s, before scientists had figured out how to use oil and turn it into something we could use for cheap energy. And oil itself was basically a natural toxin, and it was worthless. It actually devalued land. So if you were a farmer, surprisingly enough,
it was a problem, wasn't it? Yeah, it was a problem. People didn't know how to deal with it. Yeah,
that's right. People didn't want oil. They didn't know how to use it, and it was a toxin. It was a natural toxin. So farmers couldn't farm on it. Nothing would grow on it. Livestock couldn't graze on it. It was toxic. So when they discovered, and I say they, the scientists discovered that you could convert the oil into basically petrol and kerosene and this sort of thing, the government corporations at the time thought of it's going to be difficult to try and sell something to people when people knew it was worthless. So they had to give some mystique to it. And the way they did this is this is sometime around this sort of time period. This is where tourists, this is where rich people would tour the world and go on holiday. Poor people couldn't afford it back then. So they would go on tour and they would discover dinosaur bones and mummies in Egypt and this sort of thing. So dinosaur bones at the time was in the popular zeitgeist. Everyone was talking about it. So it was decided that they would say that oil came from dinosaur bones. And this gave it a sort of mystique and also a limitation to say it was made 65 million years ago and there's not much of it, so we better make use of it now. So it was more like an advertising campaign. So that's where the term fossil fuels came from. Now, at the time, scientists couldn't verify this. It was just a theory. And then later on in the 1900s, 1920, 1930, somewhere around that time, scientists tried to make oil from bones. They couldn't do it. They had the technology, they couldn't do it. So this is no, but dinosaur bones did not create oil. So they came up with another one. So the next theory was that the plankton and animal creatures died, sank to the floor of the ocean, and then tectonic shift covered them over, and then pressures and heat caused them to be converted into oil. So that was why the fossil fuel name continued. And scientists couldn't check that either. But then in the 60s or something around this sort of time, they did have the technology, so they tried it out. So they used some biomatter and all this sort of stuff, and they tried to create the same conditions that the theory suggested. And the scientists turned around and says, no, we can't create oil the way it's been the official narrative. So this carried on, but they still pushed out the fossil fuel theory, and it's always been a theory. So fast forward a little bit later, and this is where we're getting into peak oil. So in the 70s, we were being told that oil's running out, it's going to run out by 1985 or something. And then, of course, 1985 came along, and we had plenty of oil. They moved it to the 90s and 2000. So they started pushing out the narrative of peak oil. But
so
then
this is all part of some marketing campaign to instill the idea of scarcity, yeah?
That's right, to push the narrative. It's basically an advertising campaign. That's where it started from. But then, of course, the scientists were jumping on board. And then, of course, the government was then funding the scientists to jump on board this bandwagon. So then it became a sort of a science, and it was worth billions of dollars just to promote this fossil fuel idea. And it turns out that there was another idea it came from Russian scientists, and they says no. They said that oil is actually an abiotic hydrocarbon. Now, abiotic means there's no biomatter. So there is no biomatter. And they said that the oil is actually created much deeper in the Earth's core, under the high temperatures of the Earth's core, and then oil is then forced to the surface. Now, it turns out that these scientists can reproduce that in a laboratory, so their theory can be proven. Fast forward again to see the 80s and the 90s and stuff, and the early 2000s, and now NASA is coming forward and saying that they've found essentially fossil fuels on other planets. And people are going, hang on a minute, how can you find fossil fuels on other planets? You're trying to say that there used to be dinosaurs on these planets. So if you look at Titan is a moon, I think it's Saturn or Jupiter, I can't remember, I think it might be Saturn. But they have found lakes of methane on this planet, which is essentially a fossil fuel, or what is the official narrative. So NASA's coming forward and saying we can find basically abiotic hydrocarbons on other planets now. So the Russian scientists are trying to speak up, they're trying to get the message out and says, look, fossil fuels are created at the center of the Earth. Nothing to do with biomatter. And then there's other evidence that also backs up this claim. And one thing is that the fossil record on this planet, I think it's like 16,000 feet or something like that. So basically below 16,000 feet, there is no real fossil record, there is no life. But oil rigs are now drilling twice that depth than the fossil record. So they're going way below the fossil record, twice as deep, and they're still finding oil. So oil is much, much deeper than the official narrative. Okay. And just to close, and the oil fields that were actually running dry in the 70s are actually now filling back up again.
Just one point though with fossil fuels is I understood them also to be sort of forests and a further development of coal, if you like. Coal supposedly crushed trees and forests. I don't know whether it's nonsense or whether there's any truth in it, but further crushing and subject to whatever decay process out pops oil. I don't know whether that's worth throwing in there.
There is another theory to that. I mean, I've not dug. I mean, it's a rabbit hole. It does take a lot of research to get to the bottom of this. But there's research that when I say fossil fuels, I'm mainly talking about oil. And the coal, there is a theory that coal is actually crystallized oil. So that is another theory. Again, the science is very deep, very complicated, and it's very thin on the internet. As soon as I start researching it, the websites disappear. And, Google, YouTube, try and shut that down. They don't want people to know. Oh, and just want to add one more thing, is oil is the second most abundant fluid on the planet, the first being water. So that just goes to show how much oil there really is. I mean, there is no way... there's some scientists coming out that it's going to take thousands of years to run out of oil. And there's some scientists saying, well, we're never going to run out of oil unless the core of the planet basically stops and cools down. And if that happens, we've got bigger problems to deal with.
Maybe if we zoom out for a moment, it's also important to acknowledge the role of the sun in climate, in weather patterns, in climate patterns. And, this is all ignored in the mainstream debate as well. It all focuses on this disaster. It's really important for us to question these enduring stories. And one of the biggest ones for me is the fact that this argument, which is very shaky, justifies the practice of geoengineering. Geoengineering is one of those subjects that the BBC aren't shy about talking about. You can go on the BBC website. You can get there's government papers up there posted about talking about geoengineering. If you mention the phrase chemtrails, careful because you might be a conspiracy nutcase. But if you talk about geoengineering, that's happening. That's cloud seeding, solar radiation management techniques. And it's really shocking that governments could be acting without the consent of any people beneath them and putting substances, aluminium, strontium, barium, I'm not quite sure the full list, into the atmosphere as cloud seeding particles. I mean, this is just madness to do this based on a theory, as we've discussed, is got big holes in it. At the very least, it really has. And I find this shocking, and I would encourage everybody to look into the link between the falseness, the, I think, demonstrable falseness of the CO2, the man-made CO2 leading to climate disaster myth.
Yeah.
The fact that that's being used to justify these really dreadful things being sprayed up in the atmosphere, geoengineering, I think that's a real point of concern.
They are putting all these horrible chemicals into the atmosphere. And one thing to note, the aluminium is a neurotoxin. It's poisonous. So this is another subject altogether. But one of the things that the government is trying to do is basically reduce the IQ of the general population. I mean, they're doing this through our food in the water, fluoride in the water.
The education system.
Education system, the television. That's right.
The propaganda.
Many people are suffering from mental illness, and that's down to the food they're eating and the toxins that they are subjected to. Another thing as well is human IQ was actually growing much faster in the last 100 years than before, and that's mainly because humans were using much more technology, and they were just gaining higher IQ. The government is terrified of people who can think. So they are doing everything they can to make sure we can't. And one of them, I think, is the insidious nature behind this geoengineering. I think one of them is to basically poison the food and the people. I think that's what's going on. Again, this is not a rabbit hole I've dug too deeply, but yes, It's real. It can be researched. There's information out there. Chemtrails, there's pictures. Everyone can see it. I've seen chemtrails, so we know it's real.
Yeah, and the danger of making these, big decisions about restricting the amount of solar insolation to warm the planet. It's like, who said that we should be doing that? I mean, that is absolute madness. Peter, any other points around this whole climate myth that you think need to be in our minds?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to touch on is some of these environmentalists and what the government is actually doing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there who've been brainwashed and believe that the government is somehow helping the environment. And every time you research, you'll find the exact opposite. So, I mean, I'd just like to bring up one point. I think you mentioned a little earlier, is that the planet today is actually much greener than it was just 100 years ago. I think it's 3 times greener today than it was 100 years ago. This can be shown by satellite. Now, everyone's going on, or the environmentalists keep going on about deforestation, which again, when you research, that's not quite true. But however, let's just touch on that. One of the things that the UK government is doing is they've shut down our coal mines, which means that our coal power stations cannot use coal anymore. So what they've done is decided to take millions, if not billions, of taxpayers' money, pay the Canadian government to chop down forests in acres and thousands of acres, wood chip them down, convert them into wooden pellets, ship them over via cargo ship, and then now power stations are now using these wood chips from Canada, which is basically chopped down forests. Not only are you chopping down forests, but because wood chips are not as dense in energy as coal, you need 5 times as much of these wood chips as you do coal. So these power stations are a fifth as efficient. Now this is costing us billions of pounds every year, which is put onto our electricity bill in the form of taxation. So this is insane. So we are being charged tax, which is then being used to chop down trees in another country, which is then being shipped over here to use in our power stations when we could be using coal.
That is insane, isn't it? It's another example of the irrationality sort of built on irrationality. As soon as you start working from false premises, you can end up in all sorts of mess, doing destructive stuff and being incredibly inefficient. I guess we can all do our best to share the subject, to keep the debate going. It's, I think, an important one. It's a little bit like 9/11 in terms of it potentially being a gateway into people questioning more aspects of their world that they've taken as given. And it's an important one to challenge. The truth can be found. I think it's important to remember that, everybody. We can know the truth. It's just identifying the facts of reality, and it can be done. So, ladies and gentlemen, push on. Keep thinking. Keep finding out.
There's a lot of people out there. Also, I say skeptics or governments who will say that people like us who question the narrative, we must be getting paid by big oil or something like that. I mean, I think they apply this to Lord Monckton, or they say he's not a lord and all this sort of thing.
Shoot the messenger rather than listen to the message.
That's right. And then you think, well, okay, let's look at the money then. And then you find out that there's 2 arguments. One that says that man-made global warming is not real. Well, that in itself, there might be a few $1 million in that. Now, if you look at the official narrative, which is CO2 is causing global warming, and you look at the money that's pumped into that side of the debate, it's in the trillions, with a T, not billions. And the IPCC actually wants to spend $100 trillion by the year 2030 on this nonsense of man-made global warming. So that's where the money is. This is why the scientists are all coming out saying it's real, because
that's where the money is.
That's where the money is.
Yeah.
That's right. And I'd just like to touch on the other side of another argument that's given is it's big oil fighting against the companies that make solar panels or something. This is not how big business works. Big business is all about shares. So it's not a single oil company fighting, a billionaire who owns an oil company fighting another billionaire who owns a factory making solar panels. All these billionaires sitting at the top, the ruling class, they have shares in all these different companies. They hedge their bets. They've got their money in both sides of the argument. Just ask Elon Musk and see how much money he's got into his oil company shares. He may have sold them now, but he did own oil shares. So no, this is not how business works. All these people at the very top, they have shares on both sides of the argument. So it isn't big oil fighting against the environmentalists. That's almost like the political game of the left versus right, like Conservatives fighting Labour. They're the same party. So no, big business is funding both sides. They've got the money on both sides of this argument. Oil is extremely expensive today, and it shouldn't be, because the price is overinflated, and that's been done for decades. So just to give you an idea, is that the reason why oil is so cheap is you could actually, if you had a free market price for oil, free market, not controlled by the government with taxation and regulation and the manipulation of the cartel.
You mean OPEC and OPEC. The price manipulation of WTI and yes. Brent crude oil and stuff, yeah.
If you removed all that, and also the manipulation of the stock market as well, because the oil price is manipulated, and all this, if you got rid of all that, you would find that you could run a family car in the UK, and a good quality family car, an executive saloon, like a big V6 or something, for about £200 a year. Which, that's an eye-opener. Electric cars cannot compete with that. No. So this is another reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth observing, isn't it, that the internal combustion engine superseded the electric car. I mean, why is it we all drive internal combustion engines? Because they're better.
They are better.
It just works better. It's more efficient. So,
way more efficient.
So there's an awful lot of obfuscation of the real points of issue within this debate, and there's an awful lot of muddiness of the waters. The issues, the real issues, are not talked about. The scaremongering is always hyped. If you graph and chart out the numbers of environmental disaster-related deaths, it's been falling, and it's roundabout in the order of a few thousand deaths per annum. It's not talking about the millions that we were encouraged to fear was going to happen. So there's a whole lot of misinformation out there. So it is ever so important, everybody, to sift through these and be prepared to ask questions about these big topics that are perhaps harder to dislodge in our minds. They're perhaps harder to dismantle the mainstream belief that's been ingrained in us through watching the news for decades and for all of these reasons. But great. Well, just mindful of time, Pete. Anything else do you think worth saying in conclusion of this whole sort of man-made global warming fiasco debate sort of thing? Anything strings that you would like to draw together?
Yeah, I think just 2 points spring to mind. When you were talking about the deaths of people and fossil fuels in quotes, because the third world countries are not allowed to use what is stereotypically called a fossil fuel, about 6 million people are dying each year because of poverty and all the rest of it. If you can give these cheap fuels to third world countries, they could develop an economy and lift themselves out of poverty. We wouldn't have to send them foreign aid. And not only would they lift themselves out of poverty, but we would have another trading partner. So we could sell them British-made goods. It's a win-win. So we need to give these third world countries, get rid of the governments, these dictators that are put in place by our governments using foreign aid. Get rid of these governments, shut them down, let these third world countries have their fossil fuels, let them build an economy, and it will bring world peace effectively. That's what's going to happen. And I'll just leave you with one last thing. If you meet someone who believes in man-made global warming, all you can do is tell them one thing: it is impossible for the thermodynamic properties of CO2 to cause global warming. End of the conversation. That's the key. I mean, I've been on this subject for over a year, and I was researching it, and I did full circle. Went down all the rabbit holes. I looked at all the science, and I came back and I realized that CO2 cannot cause global warming like the government is saying, unless you want to also blame nitrogen and oxygen. Yeah. And that's not the government can't blame oxygen because no one's going to fall for that. Oh, and I did say that was one last thing, but one last more thing. Everyone's sick of tax. Everyone's going, oh, one day the government's going to tax the air that we breathe. Well, I've got news for you. They're already doing it, okay? When you breathe in oxygen, and then you breathe out CO2. So they've taxed the bit that you breathe out. So yes, the government has already taxed the air that you breathe.
Yeah. Carbon trading certificates and all that sort of thing, you know.
Well, of course, carbon isn't even CO2.
Yeah.
CO2 is an inert gas. Carbon is a base element. So that's another bait and switch that they've done.
Yeah,
so,
there's a lot, isn't there?
Oh.
Another one I think is important just to bring into, you know, in closing really, is that it's important to distinguish between pollution and CO2 production. Yes. And nobody would be for pollution. In fact, I think real meaningful environmental awareness is focused entirely on not defecating on your own doorstep, not creating and using compounds that are known to maliciously negatively impact human life or other life forms on the planet. This is really important, that we don't pollute, and technology to clean up pollution it has come a long way, and this is really quite exciting. But CO2 is not a pollutant, and I would challenge anybody to go away and avail themselves to the facts that can lead to the conclusion that more CO2 in the atmosphere would actually be a good thing. And just to clarify, the man-made global warming thing, I would say that given that CO2 is a CO2, it is a greenhouse gas, and that it is possible for human activity to increase it, I would concede that man-made contribution to global temperature increase is entirely feasible and possible. What I contest is the assumption that is bad news, that the yes. increases in temperature, for one, is bad news, and increases in CO2 atmospheric concentrations is another bad. I think those are the two fundamental questionables in this whole debate.
That's right. When you look at the numbers as well, is that when you look at just CO2, let's look at the numbers. So the atmosphere is about 70% oxygen, 70% nitrogen, 28% oxygen, and then the 2% is base gases or trace gases. Sorry. Well, if you look at the CO2 and you say at the moment it's about 400 parts per million, well, 97% of that is natural. So the CO2 that is in the atmosphere now, most of it comes from the ocean, and then the rest of it is from plant and animal life. So humans are only responsible for about 3% of the CO2 that's being pumped into the atmosphere, if you like. Yeah. And CO2 is, again, just a fraction of the atmosphere anyway. So when you just look at the figures, you're being played. This is just a scam.
Yeah, it's like getting percentage increases out of statistics, isn't it? It's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on.
Smoke and mirrors.
Great stuff. Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you so much, Peter, for joining me today to discuss this really important issue of, is man-made climate change due to carbon dioxide emissions, is it really happening, or is it bad news? It's really important, I think, to get stuck into this debate and find out the facts. So thank you all very much for listening and for joining us again on Lawful Rebel TV, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.
Lawful Rebel. Comprehensive goals. Lawful Rebel. Active minds, open doors. Lawful Rebel. You can see the signs. If you